by all the odds, I should not have survived. It's just difficult for me. It's not. It's just there's an emotional thing going on inside, and so it's happening right now. You know, so I just it just comes with the package is the way it is.
On January 15, 2018, the pilot of November 787 Sierra Bravo, a Velocity XL amateur-built aircraft, departed Rosecrans Memorial Airport near St. Joseph, Missouri, for a two-leg flight to Santa Fe, New Mexico. His first stop would be about 330 nautical miles southwest at Liberal Mid-America Airport in Kansas. The weather that day was unseasonably cold, a factor that would have a significant impact on the events that would transpire.
Yeah, hi, I'm John Berman. I have a private pilot's license. I have about 1,500 hours. I'm instrument rated. The day before, I had a late lunch, kind of brunch, and it went on towards about 4:30 with a friend of mine in Olathe, Kansas. Yeah, my mission here was to get back to see my daughter, who was 5 at the time. There was, without a doubt, an element of get-there-itis, which all pilots know about, you know, whatever you want to call it, that you're focused on getting where you want to go, and the probability that you're going to forget something in that state of mind goes up. And my intention had been to fly out of St. Joseph's, which is Missouri, right across the border, that evening. But it was cold and it was getting dark. This was, you know, January 14th, I guess. And I made the correct decision just to bag it. I made the correct decision not to fly.
Normally a cautious pilot, John spent a great deal of time in his pre-flight planning routine. It was common for him to spend several hours reviewing weather forecast tools available on aviationweather.gov, refreshing data numerous times to get a sense of changing conditions. He typically avoided flying in instrument meteorological conditions and was especially concerned about flying in IMC during the winter months because of the potential for icing. On January 15th, John spent about an hour and a half looking at the weather before departing on the first leg of his flight from St. Joseph, Missouri to Liberal, Kansas.
It was fine going to Liberal, Kansas, but that's when things went off track. Probably the biggest red flag, or cold red flag, was when I landed at Liberal. And you know, I had my Mac, you know, Latin MacBook, which is anodized aluminum. You know, it's a little bit of metal, it's a little bit cold. I was so cold, I didn't want to touch it. I was really cold. The Velocity, the aircraft, has the engine in the back, and the main heat duct is in the back. And I was actually going to just go to Walmart and get one of these ducts, you know, from an RV duct, one of these flexible things, and duct tape it to the back there, and just bring it up front so I could have heat blowing over me. And for one reason or another, I didn't do it. I can't remember. I mean, I was intent on doing it, but I didn't do it. I just ran into the FBO, went to the space heater, and warmed up my hands. I was thinking about getting a motel there, and I called Motel 6, and that's where I should have gone.
John considered staying for the night, but after observing the cost of keeping his airplane hangared overnight in Liberal compared to the lower nightly rate in Santa Fe, he decided to press on to New Mexico. Although John was not aware of it at the time, his self-described poor judgment was due in part to the physical and mental effects of the extreme cold temperature. Long-term exposure to such cold weather can have a significant mental and physical impact on a person, leading to confusion, forgetfulness, disorientation, reduced vigilance, and overall impaired decision-making and reasoning.
Previously, I've been meticulous and consistent about flight planning. I mean, really thorough. That was really the beginning of the end. When I was just so cold, I ran out of the plane without my trusty MacBook.
Without his MacBook, which he typically used for weather information, John neglected to perform any weather planning for the second leg to Santa Fe.
I think that had I been paying just a little bit more attention, not that much more, but there's a threshold where you can just kind of start making critically wrong decisions. Things would have turned out okay. I remember taxiing, I remember taking off and turning to head southwest, and I do remember at some point sort of a mesmerized feeling, because you're flying over the desert and there are no lights below. I did become sort of transfixed. I had things on my mind. My mom had passed away just 3 months before. And when you're up in the air at night, flying alone in particular, sometimes the mind wanders. I don't remember anything more about that until what is on the flight track, where I do remember calling ATC and telling them I thought I was in instrument conditions, IMC. And I was on flight following, so there was no call-up involved. They were monitoring. And they immediately said, well, look out to your left. There's Tucumcari in New Mexico, which I recognized the name. I'd landed there in the past. And I looked and I saw the lights. And I think that my intention was to divert and land at Tucumcari, which would have been the correct thing to do. But I didn't. I made a 360 and at a lower altitude, and I kept going. And that was the last of my opportunities, basically, to get out. The next thing I remember is seeing this gelatinous blob of liquid, which I knew was supercooled water, in the center of the windscreen. Just my nerdy science curiosity, I started looking closer at it. Got my head right up to it because it was really quite fascinating. It was kind of jiggling there. And I knew it was supercooled water. I don't think it occurred to me that, well, if there's supercooled water, it means you're in a cloud, and there's probably supercooled water on the airframe, which means you're going into icing.
When encountering supercooled large droplets in clouds, as John's Velocity did, part of the droplet freezes immediately, rapidly increasing the ice accretion rate on the airframe. The resulting distorted airflow over the Velocity's large wing surface would quickly render the airplane unflyable.
So there's this gelatinous circle blob, kind of jiggling like an amoeba or something, right in the center of the windscreen. I was just interested in looking at it, getting closer to it. But then the entire windscreen froze over. It was ice. Could not see out the front. Basically knew my number was up. This was not going to be a smooth landing. But I didn't have much time to think about it, because in under 10 seconds, maybe like 5 seconds, it suddenly, by itself, pitched forward into a dive. I knew I was over mountains at that point, and I really had only 1,500 feet of clearance. And I reached over, because it's a center stick with the right, with both hands, and I pulled back fast enough, but I didn't yank it back. But fortunately, thank God, whatever, that it did level out. I was sinking then. I was full power, and I had to pitch as far as it would go, and I couldn't keep it from sinking. It was slow. As I said, it was at most 500 feet a minute, but it could have been just a couple hundred feet a minute. And that's when I called ATC.
John declared an emergency with ATC about 12 miles from Santa Fe Airport, and 8 minutes after he accepted an IFR clearance with a climb in icing conditions. Had he declared the emergency upon first contact with Albuquerque Center, they would have been able to initiate immediate emergency assistance, providing minimum terrain and obstacle clearance altitudes and radar vectors to lower terrain.
The map display was there, and the big purple line was pointing at that point at about 2 o'clock. And I just went for it. I went for the airport. I think it was the correct decision. Somehow clear the mountains if you can, go for the airport, and then, you know, I knew I wasn't going to make the airport. I was thinking there wasn't the altitude, but at least I cleared the mountains, and I don't remember anything after heading that way.
Santa Fe 911, what's the location of emergency?
I had an airplane crash. I'm in an airplane crash.
Where at, sir?
I don't know right now.
An airplane crash?
November 787 Sierra Bravo. Can you locate me?
And you're in an airplane? Give me 1 second, okay? Are there any injuries?
I'm injured. I'm the pilot.
Okay, I'm trying to locate you, okay? Hold on just a second. 787 Sierra Bravo, you said, is the tail number?
Yes. Can you locate me, please? I think I've got broken legs.
I'm trying to locate you, sir.
God help me.
Sir, are you there?
Yeah.
So I know you were headed to the Santa Fe Municipal Airport, but where were you coming from?
I'm not sure right now. Do you have my location from the cell phone?
I'm trying to get it, sir. It's not giving me an actual location of where you're at.
I'm very cold.
I'm still here, okay?
Okay.
It took them 3 hours to find me. You know, even though they had a basic location, they said there was no moon, it was very dark, it was very cold and windy, but they did manage, and I went back and thanked the rescuers March of the following year, and met with about a dozen of them, and you know, we told our various recollections, and they said I didn't have much more time. I was so cold, so hypothermic. The thing I do remember was seeing the rescue lights off in the distance. I'm literally praying that they would return when the line of sight, they went behind an outcropping or something and they disappeared. And praying, concentrating with all my might that I would see the lights again. I remember being on my back and looking up at them in the lights. I can't say, I said, thank God you're here, thank God. God bless you. I was, in a medical coma for 2 weeks. So I have mobility and sensory problems in my legs, but I can walk. My balance is poor, but I haven't fallen in a long time. And it's not good, it's not fun at all, but there are people who are much, much worse off than I am, to say nothing of those who didn't survive accidents.
A sobering fact of this report is that while the NTSB stated that icing conditions were not present or forecast, supplemental satellite weather data indicated a local potential for icing at the accident site. But without any corroborating pilot reports of icing, an advisory was not issued for the area around the accident site. However, a METAR for Santa Fe Airport issued half an hour before the accident showed a temperature dew point spread of 3 degrees Celsius, indicative of the area's high humidity and cold temperatures. That, plus 2 air mets, one for IFR and another for mountain obscuration, which both contained warnings of precipitation and mist, and a third air met for icing in the northeastern corner of New Mexico, all offer more clues that point to the potential for icing conditions. So, in addition to local METARs and terminal forecasts, how can GA pilots form a bigger picture of developing weather, even if not explicitly observed in PIREPs or issued in airmets and SIGMETs? Various tools, such as the aviationweather.gov icing chart, could identify where potential icing might form. According to the NTSB meteorological report, the icing forecast did not mention severe icing or supercooled large droplets, just trace to moderate icing at different flight levels. However, The icing reports indicated between a 30 to 50% probability of trace to light icing at 8,000 and 9,000 feet at the accident site, and an unknown chance of supercooled large droplets around the accident time. Lastly, confirm your observations with a weather briefer, as they are trained to interpret weather conditions. Remember, trust your knowledge, but verify that you are right. As is often the case, not one, but several links combining in the accident chain can cause an accident. On this January 15th flight, self-imposed constraints, such as the urgency to get home, misplaced monetary pressures, and impaired decision-making because of the extreme cold weather, formed the links in the chain that John could not break.
There are all these things that, you just really have to stop, and think about what you may be missing.